A single virus can change the course of our entire world in just a few years. We have felt that reality ourselves in recent memory, yet this story is not new. History is a landscape scarred by forgotten plagues, outbreaks so devastating they toppled empires and rewrote cultures, only to vanish from our collective memory. This journey will unearth 25 of those ancient pandemics, from a mysterious sickness that killed Hittite kings to a strange sleeping sickness that followed a world war. You will discover how diseases we have almost forgotten shaped the world you live in today. Why did a plague in Persia change the face of religious leadership forever? How did a fever in the Caribbean help win a revolution? By the end, you will see the repeating patterns of history not as distant echoes but as urgent lessons. What forgotten story from the past do you think holds the most warning for our future? Our story begins not with a whisper, but with a royal scream echoing from clay tablets over 3,000 years old. In the heart of the ancient Hittite Empire, a powerful civilization that ruled over what is now Turkey, a desperate plea was etched into history. It was a prayer from a king, Mercilli II, to his gods. He begged them to reveal why his land was suffering, why a devastating illness was sweeping through his people, killing without mercy. He called it the hand of the pestilence. This is our first forgotten plague, and its origins were an unintended consequence of war and conquest. The Hittites, under the great king Suppiluliuma I, had been victorious against the Egyptians. As was the custom, they brought back prisoners of war, a human prize of their military might. But those prisoners carried something invisible and far deadlier than any weapon. They brought a pathogen, possibly an early form of smallpox or a disease like tularemia, into the heart of the Hittite homeland. The results were catastrophic. The plague did not distinguish between slave and sovereign. It claimed the life of the mighty Suppiluliuma himself, the architect of Hittite power. Then, in a brutal 1-2 punch of fate, it took his son and successor, Anuwanda II, just a year later. Imagine the shockwave this sent through a Bronze Age empire. In the span of mere months, the kingdom lost its legendary ruler and his chosen heir. The throne passed to a younger son, Mercilli, who was left to rule an empire that was not just grieving but literally dying around him. The military, weakened by disease, could not maintain its campaigns. Trade routes faltered as cities were stricken. The political stability that had been hard-won by Suppiluliuma evaporated into an atmosphere of fear and divine anger. Mercilli spent years performing rituals and prayers, trying to appease the gods he believed were punishing his people. This was more than a health crisis, it was an existential crisis for an entire civilization. The Hittite plague shows us the brutal formula that would repeat itself for millennia. A pathogen travels along new routes opened by human conflict. It finds a population with no immunity. It strikes at the very top of the power structure, creating a vacuum of leadership at the worst possible moment. The empire survived, but it was permanently scarred, its golden age cut short by an enemy it never saw coming. This pattern of disaster following triumph would echo again and again, as our journey moves from the rocky highlands of Anatolia to the bustling, crowded streets of another ancient metropolis. The Hittite kings prayed to their gods for deliverance from a mysterious sickness. Centuries later, in the shining cradle of democracy, a plague arrived that no prayer could stop. The year was 430 before the Common Era, and Athens stood at the peak of its power, locked in a brutal war with its rival, Sparta. The city's leader, Pericles, made a fateful strategic decision. He ordered the entire rural population of Attica to retreat behind the massive long walls, fortifications that connected Athens to its port. The idea was to create an impregnable fortress, safe from Spartan armies, but he created something else entirely. Within those walls, a dense, overcrowded, and unsanitary human petri dish was born. A ship from a distant port, possibly Egypt, carried a pathogen into this perfect storm. What followed was a horror so meticulously recorded by the historian Thucydides, who survived it himself, that his words still chill us today. This was the plague of Athens. Thucydides describes symptoms that sound like something from a nightmare. It began with a sudden, searing fever and inflammation of the eyes and throat. Victims were then racked by violent, unquenchable thirst. Their skin broke out in small pustules and ulcers, but the most terrifying detail was the internal gangrene. He wrote that many sufferers felt such a burning heat that they could not bear even the lightest clothing or linens, and some, in their desperation, threw themselves into cold water wells. The social order dissolved almost as quickly as the bodies. Fear of contagion meant the sick were abandoned by family and friends. The dead and dying lay piled in the streets and temples. With mortality so high and the future so uncertain, a profound sense of lawlessness took hold. People began to indulge in immediate pleasures, spending money freely and breaking laws because they believed they would not live long enough to face the consequences. The very ideals of Athenian civilization crumbled under the weight of sheer survival. The plague's most significant casualty was not just a citizen, but the city's guiding vision. Pericles, the architect of Athens' Golden Age and its wartime strategy, succumbed to the disease in 429. His death created a leadership vacuum filled by lesser, more reckless men who pushed Athens toward disastrous military campaigns. The city's morale, its sense of divine favor, and its civic unity were shattered. Even today, scientists pore over Thucydides' clinical notes, debating the true culprit. Was it epidemic typhus carried by the lice that would have thrived in the crowded refugee camps? Could it have been an early form of Ebola causing the hemorrhagic symptoms? Or was it typhoid fever, as some DNA evidence from ancient mass graves has suggested? The mystery remains, making this outbreak a classical cold case. This tragedy is often overshadowed by the grand narratives of Greek philosophy and epic battles, but its lesson is stark. Athens was defeated not by the Spartan sword alone, but by an invisible enemy unleashed by its own defensive strategy. It is a timeless reminder that our solutions to one crisis can sow the seeds for the next, far deadlier one. And as order collapsed in Athens, a very different kind of societal experiment was unfolding thousands of miles away, in a republic that believed it had conquered the world, only to find a plague waiting at the very moment of its greatest triumph. Athens fell into chaos as its ideals crumbled under a relentless disease. But this was not the last time a golden age would meet a microscopic end. 2 centuries after the death of Pericles, another empire believed it had achieved a lasting peace. The Roman Empire, under the wise rule of Marcus Aurelius, was experiencing the height of the Pax Romana, a period of unprecedented stability and prosperity that stretched from Britain to the borders of Persia. Then, in the year 165 of the Common Era, the legions returned from a victorious campaign in the Near East. They brought back spoils of war, and they brought back a killer. This was the Antonine Plague, also known as the Plague of Galen, after the famous physician who witnessed its horrors. The disease, now widely believed by historians to have been smallpox, swept through the empire like a fire through dry grass. It traveled along the vast Roman road network and shipping lanes, moving from military camps into crowded cities with terrifying efficiency. The death toll is almost incomprehensible. Modern estimates suggest it killed between 5 and 10 million people, perhaps a quarter of the entire empire's population. In some cities, the historian Cassius Dio recorded that 2,000 people died each day at the outbreak's peak. The streets of Rome, once bustling centers of commerce and civic life, were filled with funeral pyres that burned day and night. The impact was catastrophic on every level. The Roman military, the very engine of imperial power, was decimated. Legions were hollowed out, making it impossible to defend the vast frontiers effectively. Germanic tribes began to press across the Rhine and Danube, sensing the empire's sudden weakness. Economically, the empire seized up. Farms were abandoned for lack of workers, trade networks collapsed, and a severe inflation crisis began as the supply of goods plummeted. The Antonine Plague did not just kill people, it killed the Pax Romana itself. The era of peace and security was over, replaced by a century of crisis, instability, and slow decline. Yet within this societal breakdown, a new force quietly gained strength. While many Romans fled from the sick, a small religious group often stayed to help. These were the Christians. Their doctrine of charity and the promise of an afterlife motivated them to nurse the afflicted, regardless of faith. This selfless action, in stark contrast to the widespread panic, earned them immense moral authority and new converts. The plague, in a way, fertilized the ground for Christianity to grow from a persecuted sect into a dominant force within the empire. It was a profound shift born from desperate compassion. We can see the shadow of this plague even on the coins of the era. Portraits of Marcus Aurelius from later in his reign show a man aged beyond his years, his face lined with the stress of managing an empire in freefall. And through the writings of Galen, we get clinical, desperate notes. He described symptoms of fever, thirst, and the distinctive skin pustules, but he was powerless to stop it. The empire never fully recovered its former strength or confidence. A line had been crossed. The world's greatest superpower had been brought to its knees not by a rival army, but by an enemy it could not see. And as Rome's light began to flicker, a similar fate was unfolding far to the east, where another magnificent dynasty was about to confront a plague that would help erase it from history altogether. While the Antonine Plague shook the foundations of the Roman Empire, the structure still stood. Less than a century later, a second, even more ferocious wave of disease would arrive to ensure its collapse. This is the plague of Cyprian, a pandemic so severe it defined an entire era of chaos known as the crisis of the 3rd century. We know its horrors not from a dispassionate historian, but from a bishop who lived through the nightmare, Saint Cyprian of Carthage. His sermons provide a raw, eyewitness account that chills the soul. He described a sickness that began with a weakness in the limbs and a sudden, violent fever. The eyes would redden, the throat would ulcerate. Then came the relentless, exhausting symptoms, continuous vomiting and uncontrollable diarrhea that drained the life from its victims. In the worst cases, gangrene would blacken the hands and feet, leading to amputations or a slow, agonizing death. The streets, Cyprian wrote, were filled with more corpses than citizens. It felt like the end of the world. This biological catastrophe struck an empire already teetering on the brink. The crisis of the 3rd century was a perfect storm of civil war, economic meltdown, and barbarian invasion. 26 different men claimed the title of emperor in just 50 years. Into this political and military chaos, the plague poured gasoline. The Roman army, already fractured by constant infighting, was ravaged by disease, making the frontiers porous and indefensible. Entire provinces were abandoned. The economy, dependent on agriculture and trade, ground to a halt as workers died and shipping ceased. The empire literally began to break apart into 3 separate warring states. In their terror and confusion, the Roman populace and its desperate emperors searched for a scapegoat. They found one in the growing Christian minority. The traditional Roman gods were clearly angry, people reasoned. These Christians who refused to worship the state deities must be the cause of this divine punishment. This led to a fierce, systematic persecution, most notably under Emperor Decius. Citizens were forced to obtain certificates proving they had sacrificed to the Roman gods, and those who refused, like Cyprian himself, faced execution. The persecution was a direct attempt to restore divine favor by purging the empire of a perceived spiritual pollutant. Yet, in a tragic irony, the very plague used to justify attacking Christians became the engine for the faith's explosive growth. While many Romans fled from the sick Christian communities, inspired by their doctrine of charity and the example of Jesus, organized to care for the afflicted regardless of their religion. They provided food, water, and rudimentary nursing. They even risked their lives to give the dead a proper burial. This visible, courageous compassion in the face of societal collapse was a powerful testament. To a person watching their world disintegrate, the contrast was stark, a choice between a crumbling state that offered only persecution and a resilient community that offered tangible love and hope. The plague of Cyprian did not just weaken Rome's legions and treasury, it fundamentally eroded trust in the old order while demonstrating the strength of the new one. It was a pivotal moment where an empire's attempt to crush a belief system instead handed it a moral victory of immense proportions, setting the stage for a revolution in human thought. And as one empire fractured under the weight of disease, another, on the opposite side of the globe, was about to face a plague that would strike at the very heart of its identity, challenging not just its people but its divine mandate to rule. While Rome grappled with the plague of Cyprian, a world away a very different empire faced its own invisible reckoning. Japan in the 8th century was a land in cultural bloom, eagerly importing ideas, religion, and art from its mainland neighbor Korea. But in the year 735, a diplomatic mission returned from the Korean kingdom of Silla carrying a devastating stowaway, the smallpox virus. The epidemic that followed was so catastrophic it is seared into Japan's oldest historical records, the Nihon Shoki. The disease swept through the islands with a fury that seemed almost targeted. It did not just kill the poor and vulnerable, it ravaged the very pinnacle of society. The ruling Fujiwara clan, the most powerful family in the land, was decimated. Key government ministers, provincial governors, and countless aristocrats perished. In the capital city of Nara, the streets fell silent as up to 1/3 of the entire population succumbed. The political and social fabric of Japan was torn apart in just 3 years. In the resulting power vacuum, a profound shift occurred. With the aristocratic class weakened, the emperor and his court turned increasingly to Buddhism, seeking spiritual solace and a new source of authority. Massive resources were poured into constructing temples and commissioning grand Buddha statues, like the magnificent bronze statue at Todai-ji Temple, as acts of penance and prayer for protection. This epidemic accelerated the fusion of Buddhism with the native Shinto faith and centralized state power in a way that permanently shaped Japanese culture. The Japanese smallpox epidemic is a stark lesson in the double-edged sword of cultural exchange, where the pathways built for ideas and art can also become highways for annihilation. Meanwhile, on the vast Eurasian continent, another plague was demonstrating just how far those ancient highways could reach. We often think of the Justinianic plague, that first great outbreak of bubonic plague in the 6th century, as a Mediterranean tragedy that crippled the Byzantine Empire. But the reach of Yersinia pestis did not stop at the shores of the Middle Sea. New archaeological and genetic evidence is painting a startling picture of a pandemic that was truly global for its time. The same trade routes that carried silk and spices from China to Constantinople, the so-called Silk Roads, also carried infected fleas on rodents and in bundles of grain. There is compelling evidence the plague surged eastward along these routes, reaching into the heart of the powerful Sasanian Empire, Rome's great rival in Persia. Persian medical texts from the era describe a devastating pestilence with symptoms eerily similar to the bubonic plague. The timing could not have been more consequential. For decades, the Byzantine and Sasanian empires had been locked in a brutal, exhausting war that drained the resources and manpower of both. Then the plague arrived, sweeping through their cities and armies like a scythe. While Byzantium was certainly crippled, the Sasanian Empire, already strained by the conflict, may have been pushed past the point of recovery. Its administrative and military structures were hollowed out just as a new force was gathering strength in the Arabian Peninsula. When the armies of the Rashidun Caliphate emerged a few years later, they faced two superpowers that were shadows of their former selves, their populations depleted and their economies shattered by disease. The rapid Muslim conquests of the 7th century, which redrew the map of the Middle East and North Africa, were not solely caused by plague, but the pandemic created the perfect conditions for that historic shift. It was the silent partner in one of history's most dramatic political transformations, proving that a pathogen could alter the balance of power across entire continents without ever lifting a sword. This forgotten reach of the Justinianic plague forces us to widen our gaze, to see these ancient pandemics not as regional events, but as interconnected disasters that traveled the world long before globalization was ever a word. Silk roads built for commerce became highways for a silent, unstoppable collapse. In the year 627, the mighty Sasanian Empire of Persia was locked in a final, desperate war with its ancient rival Byzantium. Both empires were exhausted, their treasuries empty and their armies depleted from decades of conflict. Then a familiar horror returned with renewed fury. This is the plague of Pharaoh, a direct and devastating continuation of the Justinianic plague, and it struck Persia with a timing so catastrophic it feels almost orchestrated by fate. The outbreak is named for the Sasanian king, Pharaoh, also known as Kavad II, who ascended the throne in the midst of this chaos. His reign was defined by one brutal, pragmatic act to secure his power. He ordered the execution of all his brothers and rival princes. This grim calculus for stability immediately backfired. The plague, surging through trade routes and war camps, did not respect royal decrees. It swept through the imperial court and the ranks of the military with terrifying efficiency. King Pharaoh himself died of the disease after a reign of mere months, a victim of the very pandemic he had no time to comprehend. His death was not an isolated tragedy. The plague is described in contemporary sources as apocalyptic. In some regions of the empire, it is estimated that half the entire population perished. The royal family, already gutted by Pharaoh's fratricide, was further decimated by disease. The military leadership, the experienced generals and officers needed to command a faltering war effort, died in their tents and barracks. Imagine the state of the empire at this moment. Its fields lay fallow with no one to tend them. Its cities echoed with silence, hollowed out by mass death. Its government was a shell, with a rapid succession of child kings and puppets following Pharaoh, each more powerless than the last, and its vaunted army, the force that had once challenged Rome, was a ghost of itself, riddled by sickness and utterly demoralized. This was not just a crisis, it was a total systems failure. The Sasanian Empire did not simply lose a war, it dissolved from within under the weight of microbial siege. When the armies of the Rashidun Caliphate emerged from the Arabian deserts just a few years later, they did not confront a mighty Persian empire, they walked into a vacuum. The conquest was shockingly rapid because there was so little left to conquer, no cohesive army to muster, no stable leadership to organize a defense. The plague had done the hard work of unraveling a centuries-old civilization. The fall of Persia is one of history's most dramatic examples of a pathogen acting as the ultimate arbiter of power. An empire that had stood for 400 years, a bastion of culture and military might, was brought to its knees not by a superior general but by a flea. Its collapse cleared the stage for a new world order, reshaping the religious and political map of the Middle East forever. This forgotten plague reminds us that the end of an age often comes not with a bang but with a feverish whisper. And as one empire vanished into the sands, another, far to the west, would soon face a plague that traveled not on trade caravans, but on the ships of faith and conquest. The collapse of Persia was a victory written by invisible hands, yet the very conquests that disease enabled would soon face a microbial reckoning of their own. In the year 639, a new power was consolidating its breathtaking gains. The Islamic Caliphate, under the leadership of Caliph Umar, had seized the prosperous province of Syria from the weakened Byzantine Empire. The victorious army, a force of some 25,000 seasoned soldiers, was encamped at the town of Emmaus, known in Arabic as Amwas. They were the guardians of a new frontier, the muscle of a burgeoning empire. And then the air itself seemed to turn against them. A plague, likely a resurgence of the same bubonic plague that had ravaged the region for a century, erupted in the camp. It moved with a horrifying swiftness. The very closeness and camaraderie that made the army strong now made it tragically vulnerable. Soldiers fell in waves, their bodies marked by the dreaded buboes, the swollen lymph nodes that signaled a death sentence. Within weeks, the camp transformed from a symbol of triumph into a massive graveyard. The scale of the loss was unimaginable. The plague claimed the lives of approximately 25,000 people, effectively annihilating the entire army of Syria. But it was not just the loss of rank-and-file soldiers that shattered the caliphate's leadership. The disease cut down the very best of its command. Among the dead was Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah, one of the Prophet Muhammad's closest companions and the supreme commander of the Muslim forces in Syria. He was a man revered for his wisdom and military skill, a pillar of the new state. Also lost was Mu'adh ibn Jabal, a famed jurist whose knowledge was considered indispensable for building Islamic law. Their deaths were not just personal tragedies, they were a catastrophic blow to the administrative and spiritual backbone of the caliphate. News of the disaster reached Caliph Umar in Medina. He immediately set out for Syria, intent on leading and comforting his people in this crisis. But upon reaching the border, he was met by his surviving commanders with a desperate plea. They begged him not to enter the plague-stricken land, fearing for his life and the stability his leadership provided. After a profound and anguished consultation, Umar agreed. He turned back, establishing a fateful precedent. This decision cemented a crucial policy for the early caliphate. The ruler would reside in the safety of Medina, governing from a distance rather than embedding himself in newly conquered and often unstable territories. The plague of Emmaus had directly shaped the geography of power. Furthermore, the utter destruction of the Syrian army created a pressing military vacuum. To address this, and perhaps to avoid concentrating such a large force in one plague-prone region again, Umar authorized the establishment of a new, separate military garrison city at Kufa in Iraq. This was not just a tactical relocation, it was a foundational act of governance. Kufa would grow into a major center of Islamic scholarship, politics, and military power, a counterweight to Damascus. The pandemic, in its brutal efficiency, forced the early Muslim state to adapt its structure. It pushed governance toward a more centralized, remote model and encouraged the dispersal of military authority. A single outbreak at a dusty camp in Syria echoed through the halls of power, influencing where rulers lived and how armies were organized, leaving a permanent mark on the political architecture of the Islamic world. And as one faith-based empire reorganized under the shadow of plague, another, across the Mediterranean, would soon face a pestilence that seemed to target its holiest warriors. The annihilation of the Syrian army at Emmaus forced a young empire to rethink its very structure. While the caliphate adapted, another island nation far to the east was learning a different but equally brutal lesson about repeated microbial invasion. Just over half a century after the smallpox epidemic of 735 brought Japan to its knees, the pestilence returned. The Nihon Shoki, that ancient chronicle of Japan, records with grim simplicity that in the year 698, a great pestilence arose once more. This second wave is a ghost in the historical record, its details sparse, but its shadow is long and deeply significant. Scholars pore over the brief entry, debating the culprit. Was it a fresh strain of smallpox striking a population whose survivors from decades prior had only partial, waning immunity? Or was it a completely new invader like measles, arriving on a trading vessel or diplomatic mission from the Korean Peninsula or Tang Dynasty China? The symptoms are lost to time, but the outcome is clear: another wave of death crashing over a society still rebuilding from the last. This recurring trauma did something profound to the Japanese psyche and its political institutions. The first epidemic had shattered the old aristocratic clans like the Fujiwara. This second one, coming within a single lifetime, reinforced a terrifying message. The world was a dangerous, unpredictable place, and the old ways were not enough to protect the people. In this atmosphere of sustained vulnerability, the imperial court in the capital of Asuka found its moment. Centralized authority began to look less like oppression and more like the only possible shield against chaos. The court could coordinate resources, mandate rituals, and present a unified spiritual front to the gods. The repeated plagues became a powerful argument for consolidation, for pulling power inward toward the emperor and his bureaucracy, and away from the regional clan leaders who had traditionally wielded great autonomy. This drive for stability manifested in a deliberate and accelerated cultural campaign. If Japan was perpetually at risk from the mainland's diseases, perhaps it could also import the mainland's solutions. The response to the plagues was not isolation, but a strategic, almost desperate, embrace of Chinese models seen as more advanced and robust. The court aggressively pushed for the adoption of Tang legal codes, the Ritsuryo system, which provided a detailed blueprint for centralized administration, taxation, and law. They promoted Chinese-style Buddhism not just as a personal faith, but as a state-sponsored protective force, commissioning temples and sutra readings specifically to ward off illness. Even city planning shifted with the decision to build a new, permanent capital at Haijokayo, known today as Nara, based directly on the grid pattern layout of the Chinese capital of Chang'an. This was not mere aesthetic borrowing, it was an attempt to architect a more orderly and therefore more defensible society. The Great Pestilence of 698, therefore, is more than a forgotten footnote. It was the second hammer blow that helped forge the Japanese state. By demonstrating that vulnerability was a permanent condition, it pushed the ruling elite toward a definitive choice to build a stronger, more centralized and consciously Sinicized nation. The plagues made Japan feel weak, and its response was to systematically rebuild itself in the image of what it perceived as the world's strongest civilization. This pattern of crisis driving cultural transformation would replay across the globe. But next, our journey takes us to a continent where a plague arrived not on trade ships, but on the very first European ships to ever reach its shores, with consequences so absolute they echo in the silence of lost kingdoms. The Great Pestilence of 698 helped forge a centralized state from fear and loss. But sometimes a plague arrives not as a slow wave, but as a sudden, inexplicable storm. England in the late summer of 1485 was a land on edge, its crown contested in a brutal civil war. When Henry Tudor landed with his army to claim the throne, he brought more than soldiers. A strange and terrifying sickness traveled with them. This was the English sweating sickness, a disease so swift and brutal it seemed almost supernatural. Its onset was not gradual, it was a violent ambush. A person could be perfectly healthy at noon, and by nightfall be gripped by a sudden, profound sense of dread, followed by intense cold shivers. Then came the defining symptom, a torrential, drenching sweat that soaked the victim's clothes and bedding. This was accompanied by a crushing headache, severe pain in the neck and limbs, and a rapid, irregular pulse. Delirium set in quickly. The entire horrific progression from first chill to final breath often took less than 24 hours. If you survived the first day, you were likely to recover, but many did not. It cut down the young and healthy with a particular ferocity, sparing the elderly and children, a pattern that inverted the usual order of mortality and added to its terrifying reputation. The disease appeared with an eerie political synchronicity. It first erupted in Henry's army as he marched toward London, and then exploded in the capital just after his coronation as King Henry VII. For the next 66 years, the sweat returned in 5 major waves, each time coinciding with periods of political tension or succession crisis in 1507, 1517, 1528, and finally 1551. It was as if the sickness fed on national anxiety. Its cause remains one of history's greatest medical mysteries. Contemporary doctors were baffled. They blamed everything from the damp English air and the consumption of beer to the wrath of God. Modern scientists have proposed several theories, each with compelling clues but no definitive proof. Some researchers point to the symptoms, which closely resemble those of hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, a disease carried by rodents. Others suggest it could have been a particularly virulent and now extinct strain of coronavirus or influenza. The pattern of outbreaks, often starting in port towns or army camps, suggests a rodent or insect vector that arrived on ships from the continent. Yet the true culprit has vanished, leaving behind only chilling accounts in letters and chronicles. The social impact was profound. During outbreaks, courts would dissolve, parliament was postponed, and trade halted. People were afraid to gather, terrified that a simple conversation could lead to a death sentence by nightfall. Then, as mysteriously as it arrived, the sweat vanished after 1551, never to return in its original, terrifying form. Its disappearance is as puzzling as its appearance. Did the pathogen mutate into a milder form? Did changes in housing or sanitation break its transmission cycle? Or did the English population simply develop a lasting immunity? We may never know. The English sweating sickness stands as a stark monument to the capricious nature of disease, a ghost in the historical record that reminds us how quickly a familiar world can be overturned by a fever that leaves no trace. And as one mysterious sweat faded from Europe, a far deadlier exchange was beginning across the Atlantic, where 2 worlds were meeting for the first time, and one of them was carrying invisible annihilation in its very breath. The ghost of the English sweat vanished as mysteriously as it appeared, but across the ocean, a different kind of pestilence was leaving a permanent scar on the landscape of humanity. In the highlands of what is now Mexico, a word entered the historical record that would come to symbolize absolute devastation, coccolistly. In the Nahuatl language, it simply meant pestilence, but the events of 1545 and 1576 gave it a horrifying new meaning. These were the coccolistly epidemics, and they represent one of the deadliest demographic catastrophes the world has ever witnessed. Spanish friars and Aztec scribes working together after the conquest left chilling accounts. The sickness began with a raging fever and an intense headache. Victims would then develop a strange, dark tongue. Soon after, their bodies would begin to hemorrhage, bleeding from the eyes, the nose, and the mouth. Jaundice turned their skin a sickly yellow, and finally, they would writhe in agony from severe abdominal pain and neurological distress before death took them, often within just 3 or 4 days. The speed and gruesomeness of the symptoms left communities paralyzed with terror. For centuries, the cause of coccolistly was a haunting mystery. Was it smallpox which had already swept through the region? Was it typhus or some form of viral hemorrhagic fever? Then, in 2018, a team of scientists made a breakthrough. By analyzing DNA from the teeth of victims buried in a mass grave connected to the outbreak, they found evidence of a deadly bacterial strain, Salmonella enterica paratifici. This is a pathogen that causes enteric fever, a condition with symptoms that match the historical descriptions almost perfectly: high fever, gastrointestinal torment, and internal bleeding. This bacterium was likely not native to the Americas. It almost certainly traveled across the Atlantic in the bodies of European settlers or their livestock, finding a catastrophic opportunity in a population with zero prior immunity. The scale of the loss is almost beyond comprehension. Modern historians estimate that up to 15 million people perished across Mesoamerica, a staggering 80% of the population in some regions. Entire villages were completely wiped out, leaving only empty houses and silent fields. The intricate social and economic networks of the Aztec Empire and its neighboring states, already reeling from the military conquest, were atomized. This is where the pandemic's historical role becomes devastatingly clear. The Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire, led by Hernán Cortés, is often framed as a triumph of steel, horses, and political cunning. But that military victory in 1521 was just the opening act. The true enabler of lasting Spanish domination was the biological collapse that followed. When the Coccolistli struck, it did not just kill people, it destroyed the very fabric of indigenous society. The farmers who grew the food, the engineers who maintained the complex Chinampa agricultural systems, the laborers, the artisans, the local leaders who could organize resistance, they were all gone. The Spanish found themselves ruling over a ghost land. This catastrophic depopulation made it impossible for any large-scale, coordinated rebellion to take hold. It allowed the Spanish to claim vast tracts of empty, fertile land for their haciendas. It forced the survivors into a state of utter dependency, breaking their cultural and spiritual resilience. The conquest was secured not in the battle for Tenochtitlan, but in the silent, fever-ridden years that emptied a continent. The Coccolistli epidemics stand as a grim testament to the unintended consequences of collision between separate worlds, a reminder that the most effective weapon of empire is often not the sword, but the silent passenger it carries. The Coccolistli epidemics emptied a continent through silent, biological conquest. But as the 17th century gave way to the 18th, Europe believed it had finally learned to contain its oldest microbial enemy. The Black Death was a medieval nightmare, or so they thought. Then, in the spring of 1720, a magnificent merchant ship, the Grand Saint-Antoine, sailed into the bustling port of Marseille. It carried a fortune in silks and cotton from the Levant, and it carried death. This was the Plague of Marseille, the last great eruption of the bubonic plague in Western Europe, a forgotten final act of the Second Plague pandemic that proved civilization's defenses were still tragically porous. The Grand Saint-Antoine's voyage was doomed from the start. The plague had broken out on board during its journey, claiming the life of the ship's surgeon. By the time it reached Marseille, several crew members were dead. Standard port procedure demanded a strict quarantine. The ship's cargo was supposedly transferred to a lazaretto, an isolation hospital on an island, for airing out. But here, greed and connections overruled caution. Powerful Marseillais merchants, eager to access the valuable textiles for a major fair, pressured officials to bend the rules. Contaminated bales of cotton harboring infected fleas were smuggled ashore. Within days, the first cases appeared in the city's poorest neighborhoods. The plague had breached the wall. What followed was a catastrophe of 100,000 lives in Provence alone, with Marseille losing perhaps half of its population. But the response was not the pure chaos of the medieval era. This outbreak became a brutal laboratory, a bridge between medieval terror and modern epidemiology. As the death toll soared, authorities imposed a draconian solution. They built a literal wall, the Mur de la Peste, or plague wall, across the countryside. Stone barriers and guard posts stretched for miles, manned by soldiers with orders to shoot anyone trying to cross. Marseille was sealed off from the world, and within its walls, a grim societal machinery clicked into gear. The city's organization was chillingly efficient. A plague director was appointed, wielding absolute power. Bodies were collected night and day by convicts, and beggars promised freedom or pay, then thrown into mass burial pits quicklime. Houses of the sick were marked with a cross and boarded up, the inhabitants left to their fate. Yet alongside this brutality came sophisticated data tracking. Officials kept meticulous daily registers of the dead, categorizing them by parish, attempting to map the pestilence's spread. They enforced sanitation edicts, clearing garbage from streets and burning the possessions of the deceased. It was a macabre fusion of absolute power and nascent scientific observation, a desperate attempt to manage the unmanageable through both force and record-keeping. The plague's eventual retreat after 2 years did not feel like a victory but an exhaustion. It left a profound psychological scar on France and served as a stark warning to all of Europe. The Marseille outbreak demonstrated that even in an age of growing enlightenment, a single lapse in quarantine driven by commerce and corruption could unleash medieval horror. It pushed other nations to strengthen and standardize their maritime quarantine laws, shaping the international health protocols that would slowly evolve over the next century. This forgotten plague was an ending and a beginning, the last gasp of an ancient scourge in the West and a hard lesson that spurred the very systems designed to prevent its return. And as Europe refined its defenses against one classic threat, a very different kind of fever was already traveling the globe on a new network of empire, one that would not just kill but enslave the mind and body of its victims. Marseille's stone plague wall was a desperate attempt to contain a medieval terror with 18th century force. But just a few decades later and far to the east, another empire faced a similar horror with a very different kind of riot as the result. This was the Russian plague of 1770, an outbreak that began as a distant echo of war and ended by shaking the foundations of Moscow itself. The spark came from the front lines of the Russo-Turkish War. Russian soldiers fighting in Moldavia and Wallachia contracted the bubonic plague from the region. When the army returned north, the disease traveled with them, slipping past initial, poorly enforced quarantines. It first took hold in the outskirts of Moscow, among the poorer districts where soldiers mingled with factory workers and traders. From there, it crept toward the city's heart. As the death toll climbed, panic set in. The city's working class, already living in cramped, unsanitary conditions, felt abandoned. The wealthy and the nobility fled to their country estates, leaving the poor to face the pestilence alone. In this atmosphere of fear and perceived betrayal, people turned desperately to faith. They began flocking to a miracle-working icon of the Virgin Mary at the Varvaka gates, believing it could protect them from the plague. The crowds, of course, created a perfect environment for the disease to spread even faster. Seeing this, the city's authorities, led by Archbishop Ambrosius, made a logical but fateful decision. To break up the dangerous gatherings, he ordered the icon removed. To a terrified, grieving populace, this was not a medical intervention. It was an act of profound sacrilege, a removal of their last hope. A mob descended on the Kremlin's Chudov monastery. They found Archbishop Ambrosius and beat him to death. This murder was the trigger for the Moscow Plague riot, a massive uprising that saw rioters loot monasteries, destroy quarantine homes, and even storm the city's jail, freeing prisoners. For 3 days, Moscow was in the hands of an angry, terrified mob, a city consumed by both disease and anarchy. The news reached Empress Catherine the Great at her palace. Her response was swift, decisive, and utterly pragmatic. She sent her most trusted general, Grigory Orlov, with full imperial powers and a regiment of troops. Orlov restored order with a firm hand, but he also brought a systematic plan. He implemented brutally strict, militarized quarantines, cordoning off entire neighborhoods. He organized the cleanup of the filth-choked streets and canals that had fostered the plague. Understanding that fear was a fuel for rebellion, he also addressed the practical needs of the people, setting up new hospitals, food distribution points, and even raising wages for those who worked in plague services. Catherine's handling of the crisis was a turning point. The riot had shown the danger of a weak, disorganized state response. Her actions demonstrated the power of a strong, centralized one. The epidemic, which claimed over 100,000 lives in Moscow alone, became a case study in imperial control. In its aftermath, Catherine instituted lasting reforms, creating a more permanent system of quarantines, sanitary inspections, and public hospitals. The Russian plague of 1770 was more than a disease outbreak, it was a political lesson. It proved that public health was not just a medical issue, but a cornerstone of state stability. and that managing a pandemic required both uncompromising authority and a measure of compassionate pragmatism to keep the people from turning their fear against the rulers themselves. This hard-won lesson in control would soon be tested in a very different arena, as a new kind of disease emerged not from war, but from the very heart of the natural world, one that would target the most vulnerable link in the human chain. Catherine the Great's brutal pragmatism contained the plague riot in Moscow, but 2 years later and 2,000 miles to the southeast, another empire faced a microbial storm with no such central authority to hold it back. The Persian plague of 1772 was a fire that burned along the ancient pathways of faith and commerce, leaving a spiritual and political vacuum in its wake. It began not in a war camp but in a holy city. In the spring of that year, residents of Baghdad began falling ill with the telltale signs of bubonic plague, the fever, and the agonizing swellings in the groin and armpits. From that epicenter, the disease found perfect vectors for its spread. It traveled south with Shia pilgrims heading to the sacred shrine cities of Najaf and Karbala, places where immense crowds gathered in devotion, now gathering in shared vulnerability. It moved north and east along bustling trade caravan routes into Persia itself, carried by merchants and their goods. The plague showed no mercy to the faithful. The shrine cities were utterly devastated. Najaf and Karbala were not just spiritual centers, they were the beating heart of Shia Islamic scholarship and clerical authority. The plague swept through their religious seminaries and crowded neighborhoods with horrific efficiency. Contemporary accounts describe streets choked with the dead, with survivors too few to bury them all. The loss of life among the ulama, the learned clergy, was catastrophic. An entire generation of scholars, theologians, and jurists was wiped out. This was more than a demographic tragedy, it was an intellectual and spiritual decapitation. The intricate networks of teaching and religious interpretation that had been built over centuries were severed in a matter of months. The long-term effect was a profound disruption in the continuity of Shia religious leadership, creating a vacuum that would take decades to fill and subtly shifting the center of theological gravity. Meanwhile, the plague was ravaging the heartland of Persia, then ruled by the Zand dynasty under Karim Khan Zand. His reign had been a period of relative stability and cultural revival after decades of chaos, but his authority was still fragile, based more on personal loyalty than on deeply entrenched institutions. The plague struck at the very foundations of this tenuous peace. As farming communities died out, agriculture collapsed, leading to famine that compounded the death toll. Trade ground to a halt as merchants feared to travel. The royal treasury, dependent on taxes from land and commerce, emptied. Karim Khan, himself based in Shiraz, imposed quarantines and even built a wall to try to isolate his city, but the disease was everywhere. By the time the plague subsided in 1773, it had killed an estimated 2 million people across the region. The Zand dynasty was left ruling a shattered, impoverished, and traumatized kingdom. When Karim Khan died just 6 years later, in 1779, there was no strong state structure left to peacefully transfer power. His death triggered a brutal civil war among his successors, a conflict that a healthy empire might have weathered, but this one was already bled white. Into this power struggle stepped a new force, the Qajar tribe, led by the ruthless Agha Mohammad Khan Qajar. The Qajars, who had been waiting in the wings in the northern provinces, faced a Zand dynasty that was militarily and economically exhausted, its human resources depleted by the plague. The conquest was not a dramatic battle against a mighty foe, it was the mopping up of a ghost state. By 1794, Agha Mohammad had captured the last Zand ruler and crowned himself Shah, founding the Qajar dynasty that would rule Persia until the 20th century. The forgotten plague of 1772 did not just kill millions, it erased the clerical class of a major world religion and cleared the political stage for a new imperial act. It is a stark lesson in how a pathogen can rewrite a nation's future by simply removing the people who give it meaning and order. And as one dynasty fell to a flea-borne fever, another kind of sickness was already circling the globe, one that would not just kill, but imprison its victims in a waking nightmare. A plague had cleared the stage for a new Persian dynasty, but in the Caribbean, a different fever was about to write a revolutionary victory. The yellow fever outbreaks of the 1790s were not random tragedies. They were biological weapons in a war of liberation, their ammunition forged in the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade. The virus, endemic to West Africa, traveled across the ocean in the blood of enslaved people and in the water barrels of slave ships, which also carried its vector, the Aedes aegypti mosquito. In Africa, many people had developed some immunity through childhood exposure. In the Caribbean, the non-immune populations of European soldiers and colonists were perfect targets. When the Haitian Revolution erupted in 1791, the French army sent to crush the rebellion walked into a perfect microbial storm. The symptoms were a special kind of hell known as the black vomit. It began with fever, chills, and agonizing muscle pain. Then came the jaundice that turned the skin and eyes a sickly yellow, giving the disease its name. In the final, horrific stage, victims would hemorrhage internally, vomiting up dark, partially digested blood. The French troops, fresh from Europe and packed into coastal garrisons, were sitting ducks for the mosquitoes that bred in the island's warm, wet climate. The disease killed with terrifying efficiency. Of the 65,000 troops France sent to Saint-Domingue, historians estimate yellow fever killed up to 55,000 of them. Entire regiments were wiped out before they ever saw significant combat. One French general wrote in despair that his army was melting away in his hands. This biological decimation was the revolution's silent, most effective ally. It sapped French morale, destroyed their ability to mount sustained campaigns, and forced Napoleon Bonaparte to abandon his dreams of a new world empire. By the time the revolutionary leader Toussaint Louverture and his successors secured Haiti's independence in 1804, yellow fever had done much of the fighting for them. It was a pandemic with a profound political outcome, ensuring the birth of the world's first Black Republic. Yet, this same disease that liberated one people would soon be used to control another, as European powers began to see quarantine not just as defense, but as an instrument of imperial power. This lesson in control was written in stone on the island of Malta just a few years later. In 1813, as the Napoleonic Wars raged, the bubonic plague arrived in this British protectorate, likely aboard a ship from Alexandria. It killed around 5,000 people, a devastating blow to the small island. But the British response was not panic. It was a cold, systematic experiment in absolute sanitary control. The governor, Sir Thomas Maitland, declared martial law and implemented a set of regulations so severe they were known as the Maltese Code. The entire island was locked down under military supervision. Houses were sealed, with the sick taken to isolation hospitals and the healthy forced to stay inside for 40 days, their food delivered by soldiers. Every piece of clothing or bedding from an infected home was burned. Perhaps most significantly, Maitland established a permanent, empowered board of health with the authority to enforce these rules without question. The code worked brutally, and it became a blueprint. The British Empire, managing a global network of trade routes, saw in Malta's harsh success a model for protecting its commercial and military interests. The Maltese Code directly influenced quarantine laws from Gibraltar to Hong Kong, creating a standardized imperial shield against disease. These two outbreaks back-to-back reveal the dual nature of pandemics in the age of empire. In Haiti, an endemic disease became an accidental weapon of the oppressed, toppling colonial ambitions. In Malta, a classic plague became a textbook for the oppressor, refining the tools of surveillance and control that would uphold colonial rule for another century. The microbes were the same, but their historical roles were dictated entirely by who held the power to write the rules of containment. The British Code of Quarantine forged in Malta was a shield for empire, but a new enemy was already gathering in the waters of the Ganges. In 1817, a strange and ruthless sickness erupted in the dense, humid delta of the sacred river. This was the first of 7 great cholera pandemics, a disease that seemed to turn the human body against itself with terrifying speed. It began with sudden, crippling cramps in the legs and abdomen. Then came the violent, unstoppable diarrhea described as rice water stool that drained the body of fluids with shocking efficiency. Victims became hollow-eyed and gaunt within hours, their skin cold and slack, taking on a ghostly, bluish tint as dehydration and shock set in. A person could be healthy at dawn and dead by sunset, their life force literally poured out onto the ground. This rapid, grotesque transformation made cholera a specter of pure terror, a thief that stole life not in days but in hours. Medical professionals of the era were utterly confounded. The dominant theory of disease was miasma, the belief that sickness came from bad air, from the foul smells of rotting waste and stagnant water. Doctors would walk through affected neighborhoods holding scented handkerchiefs to their noses, believing the stench itself was the cause. They prescribed treatments like bloodletting or doses of mercury, which only hastened the dehydration and death of their patients. The true culprit, a comma-shaped bacterium called Vibrio cholerae thriving in contaminated water, was invisible to them and contrary to everything they thought they knew. This first pandemic was a collision between an ancient scourge and a newly connected world. For centuries, cholera had likely been a localized threat in the Indian subcontinent. But the early 19th century had forged new links of global exchange. Steamships now plied the seas, carrying goods and people faster than ever before. Overland trade routes through Central Asia were bustling. The disease hitched a ride on this modern network. It traveled from Bengal by ship across the Bay of Bengal, ravaging Ceylon and Southeast Asia. It moved overland with pilgrims and merchants into Afghanistan and Persia, reaching the shores of the Caspian Sea. By 1823, it had crossed into the southern reaches of the Russian Empire and touched the edges of the Ottoman Empire. British troops carried it as far as the shores of the Arabian Sea and the eastern coast of Africa. For the first time in history, a pandemic born in a specific river delta could threaten the world within a few short years, its speed a grim testament to the new era of industry and empire. This first wave was a warning shot, a demonstration of a new kind of microbial velocity. It baffled the medical establishment, exposed the vulnerabilities of global trade, and introduced the world to a blue-lipped horror that would return again and again, each time forcing humanity to confront the uncomfortable truth that its greatest advancements were also creating pathways for its most profound fears. Cholera's terrifying speed revealed a newly connected world, but another ancient killer was already stirring, waiting for its own moment on the global stage. The third plague pandemic began not with a roar, but with a quiet, persistent burn in the remote highlands of Yunnan, China, around 1855. For decades, it smoldered locally, a tragic but distant reality for the outside world. Then, the modern age gave it wings. The very steamships and railways that powered 19th century globalization became its express routes. From Yunnan, it traveled down the Pearl River to the bustling port of Canton, and then to the British colony of Hong Kong. There, in 1894, it exploded onto the world scene, igniting a pandemic that would quietly persist for over a century, claiming more than 15 million lives and becoming the forgotten backdrop to the modern era. This pandemic's greatest legacy was not its death toll, but the scientific revolution it forced. For centuries, the true cause of plague was shrouded in myth and miasma theory. The horror in Hong Kong created a race against time, and among scientists, 2 researchers descended on the colony, working in fierce, parallel competition. One was the renowned Japanese bacteriologist Kitasato Shibasaburo. The other was a younger Swiss-French physician named Alexander Yersin. With incredible speed and under appalling conditions, Yersin succeeded. He isolated the culprit from the swollen lymph nodes of victims, a rod-shaped bacterium he initially called Pasteurella pestis. We know it today as Yersinia pestis, named in his honor. This was the pivotal moment, the first time the ghost of the Black Death was given a name and a face under the microscope, but identifying the bacterium was only half the battle. The mystery of how it spread remained. Yersin observed the link to rats, noting that outbreaks in humans seemed to follow massive die-offs of the rodent population. The final piece of the puzzle was confirmed a few years later when another scientist demonstrated the precise mechanism, the rat flea. When an infected rat died, its fleas, now starving, would leap to a new host, a human, injecting the bacteria with their bite. This discovery of the animal reservoir and insect vector was a monumental leap in epidemiology. It moved public health thinking from vague notions of bad air to a concrete understanding of ecological chains, showing that human disease could be rooted in the lives of animals and insects. The pandemic's global reach was a brutal demonstration of this new interconnectedness. One of its most shocking and often overlooked chapters unfolded not in Asia, but in a major American city. In March 1900, a ship from Hong Kong arrived in San Francisco. Soon after, a man was found dead in the city's Chinatown. City and state officials, fearing economic ruin, tried desperately to cover it up, dismissing it as an isolated incident. But the truth could not be contained. The plague took hold in the crowded, marginalized neighborhood, fueled by prejudice and unsanitary conditions. The official response was a scandal of denial and racial discrimination, with authorities initially quarantining only the Chinese population, a move based on bias, not science. It took years of pressure from federal health officials and the persistence of the disease itself to force a proper, city-wide sanitation campaign that finally ended the outbreak by 1904. The San Francisco plague showed that even the most modern nations were vulnerable, and that politics and prejudice could be as deadly as the pathogen itself. This global crisis created an urgent need for a global response. The repeated waves of plague alongside cholera forced nations to the table. A series of international sanitary conferences began, leading to the first international sanitary regulations in 1903. These were the direct ancestors of today's World Health Organization regulations. They established standardized quarantine periods, required ships to carry sanitation certificates, and created protocols for reporting outbreaks. The third plague pandemic, in its relentless century-long march, did something profound. It forged the very framework of international public health cooperation. It taught the world that in an age of steam and steel, disease control could no longer be a national affair, but required a pact between all nations. This long, quiet pandemic was the painful midwife to the modern systems we now rely upon. A forgotten crisis that built the walls we assume have always been there. The global cooperation forged by plague could not prepare the world for the nightmare that followed the Great War. Between 1915 and 1926, a strange sleeping sickness emerged from the shadows, a pandemic so bizarre it seemed to belong more to Gothic fiction than to medical history. This was encephalitis lethargica. Its victims did not bleed or cough. They simply began to fade away into a profound and terrifying stillness. The first symptom was often an overwhelming, irresistible sleepiness. People would fall asleep at work, at dinner, mid-conversation, sinking into a slumber so deep they could not be roused, but this was no peaceful rest. For many, the sleep was a gateway to something far worse. They would awaken, if they awoke at all, trapped within their own bodies. A severe Parkinson's-like paralysis would set in, freezing their muscles into rigidity. Their faces became expressionless masks. Some were left in a permanent statue-like state, fully conscious and aware, yet utterly unable to move or speak, a condition doctors called a kinetic mutism. They were prisoners in the silent cells of their own flesh. The timing of this horror was chillingly suspicious. It spread in the wake of the devastating 1918 influenza pandemic, leading many researchers to believe the two were connected. Was the sleeping sickness a rare, catastrophic side effect of the flu virus, a terrible post-infection autoimmune response where the body's own defenses attacked the brain? Or was it an entirely separate, unknown pathogen that simply exploited a population weakened by the earlier pandemic? A century later, we still do not know for certain. No causative agent has ever been conclusively identified, and the disease vanished as mysteriously as it appeared, leaving behind a haunting medical cold case and profound human wreckage. For those who survived the initial acute phase, the tragedy was often just beginning. Thousands were left with permanent neurological damage, living out decades in institutions, motionless and forgotten. Their poignant story was brought to light decades later by the neurologist Oliver Sacks in his book Awakenings. In the late 1960s, Sacks administered a new drug, L-Dopa, to these surviving post-encephalitic patients. The results were like a miracle. Individuals who had been frozen for decades suddenly awoke, speaking, moving, reconnecting with a world they had left half a century before. But the awakening was tragically brief. The drug's effects often wore off or led to uncontrollable physical and psychological turmoil, and many patients retreated into their frozen states. Their story remains one of medicine's most heartbreaking chapters, a glimpse of life cruelly returned and then lost again. This pandemic left no monuments, only empty hospital wards and unanswered questions, a reminder that some of history's greatest terrors are not those that kill quickly, but those that steal away the self, leaving a shell behind. The silent prisons of encephalitis lethargica were a medical mystery, but another disease of the same era was brutally straightforward in its cause and its cruelty. As World War I collapsed into the Russian Civil War, a perfect storm of human suffering was brewing. The Russian typhus epidemic from 1918 to 1922 was not a singular event, but a wildfire fed by the dry tinder of total societal breakdown. The pathogen was Rickettsia prawiskii, a bacterium spread not through the air or water, but by the relentless scratching of a filthy, overcrowded body. The vector was the humble body louse, and the early 20th century provided it with a paradise. Imagine the landscape after the Great War. Russia was shattered. Its economy was in ruins, its transportation networks destroyed. Millions of soldiers, prisoners of war, and displaced civilians were on the move, crammed into filthy boxcars, packed into makeshift refugee camps, and crowded into freezing, unwashed barracks. Personal hygiene became an impossible luxury. In these conditions, the body louse thrived, moving effortlessly from one starving, weakened host to another, carrying the deadly bacteria with it. The symptoms were a signature of misery. It began with a sudden, soaring fever, a crushing headache, and severe muscle pain. A rash would often break out, spreading from the torso. In severe cases, the disease could cause delirium, gangrene in the extremities, and a terrifying drop in blood pressure leading to death. It was a sickness that wore the face of the poverty and chaos that spawned it. The numbers are almost too vast to comprehend. Historians estimate the epidemic killed at least 3 million people in Russia proper, and another 3 to 5 million in Poland and other Eastern European regions caught in the turmoil. In some cities, up to a quarter of the population was infected. This was not merely a health crisis, it was a demographic cataclysm unfolding alongside famine and warfare. For the new Bolshevik government struggling to secure its grip on power, the typhus epidemic presented both an existential threat and a unique political opportunity. Vladimir Lenin himself famously declared that either socialism would defeat the louse or the louse would defeat socialism. The fight against typhus became a central plank of revolutionary rhetoric, a battle for the very survival of the state. This justified radical, often coercive, public health measures. The state mobilized thousands of young communists into sanitation brigades, They conducted forced delousing operations, sometimes at gunpoint, shaving heads and steam-cleaning clothes. Private property was confiscated to house the sick. The epidemic provided a pretext for extending state control into the most intimate aspects of daily life, all in the name of hygiene and revolutionary necessity. Public health campaigns were fused with political propaganda, framing cleanliness as a proletarian duty and the bourgeois as carriers of disease. The fight against typhus became a tool for consolidating power, demonstrating the regime's organizational might while suppressing dissent under the banner of emergency measures. Into this hellscape came an unprecedented international response, most notably from the American Relief Administration, led by future President Herbert Hoover. This was a massive humanitarian operation, delivering over 700,000 tons of food and medical supplies. But the RA's mission went beyond mere distribution. Their doctors and engineers set up model hospitals, implemented strict delousing stations at railway junctions, and educated local populations on basic sanitation. They fought the disease while also battling the deep suspicion of the Bolshevik authorities, who saw them as potential spies or agents of counter-revolution. The work was dangerous and grueling, yet it saved countless lives, providing a glimmer of order in a world of chaos. The Russian typhus epidemic stands as one of history's darkest examples of disease as a symptom of collapse. It showed how a microscopic organism could exploit the fractures of war, thriving on movement, poverty, and despair. It revealed how public health could be weaponized for political control, and how compassion could cross ideological lines in the face of overwhelming human need. This was a plague born from the failure of men, a final, feverish chapter of the war to end all wars. And as the world began to piece itself back together, believing such horrors were behind it, a very different kind of pandemic was already circling the globe, one that would not discriminate between the clean and the filthy, the victor and the vanquished. Typhus was a plague of poverty and filth, but the next great pandemic preyed on a society's deepest vulnerability, its children. The polio epidemics of the early to mid-20th century cast a long, cold shadow over an era of remarkable progress, a seasonal terror that arrived with the summer heat. This was a virus that seemed to target the very symbol of a nation's future, leaving paralysis and death in playgrounds and backyards. Its impact was psychological as much as physical, a dread that hung over every swimming pool and neighborhood gathering. While the world focused on wars and economic crises, families lived with a private, intimate fear that their child might be the next to lose the ability to walk or worse, to breathe. The disease struck with cruel randomness. Most infections were mild, but in a small, terrifying percentage of cases, the polio virus attacked the nervous system. It could begin with a fever and a sore throat, symptoms easily mistaken for a common summer cold. Then, within hours, a child might complain their legs felt weak or strange. The paralysis could spread upward with horrifying speed. If it reached the muscles controlling the diaphragm, the child would suffocate unless given mechanical aid. This was the nightmare that drove the panic during major outbreaks like the one that gripped New York City in 1916. That summer, the city became a battleground. Health officials, operating with limited understanding, imposed draconian measures. They quarantined families in their homes marked with placards. They banned children from public gatherings, closed movie theaters and pools, and even sprayed streets with disinfectant in a futile attempt to kill an enemy they could not see. Over 6,000 people died in the United States that year, most of them young children, and the fear etched itself into the national consciousness. The terror reached its peak in 1952, the worst polio year in American history. Nearly 58,000 cases were reported, with over 3,000 deaths and 21,000 people left with some form of paralysis. Hospitals were overwhelmed, their wards filled with the distinctive whirring and sighing of rows of iron lungs. These massive metal cylinders were both a marvel of engineering and a symbol of the disease's terrible grip. A patient would be sealed inside with only their head exposed, the machine's bellows rhythmically creating negative pressure to pull air into their paralyzed lungs. The image of a child's head protruding from a gleaming metal tube became one of the most poignant and haunting icons of the era, a portrait of life sustained by machinery. This collective dread, however, forged an unprecedented public determination. The March of Dimes campaign, founded by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who himself was paralyzed by polio, mobilized a nation. Ordinary people mailed in dimes by the millions, funding care for victims and, crucially, financing the urgent race for a vaccine. The competition between two brilliant scientists, Jonas Salk and Albert Sabin, became a high-stakes drama watched by the world. Salk's approach used a killed virus, while Sabin championed a live, weakened oral vaccine. In 1955, after the largest clinical trial in history involving nearly 2 million children, Salk's vaccine was declared safe and effective. The announcement was met with church bells ringing and spontaneous celebrations. Parents wept with relief. It was a moment of pure collective triumph over a visible, shared enemy. Yet the story did not end there. Sabin's oral vaccine, easier to administer and providing longer-lasting community immunity, eventually became the global standard, leading to near eradication of the wild virus. The polio pandemics remind us that a disease's power lies not just in the bodies it claims, but in the fear it implants in a society's soul. It was a battle fought not on distant fronts, but in suburban homes and research labs, a testament to how vulnerability can unite a world in a common purpose, turning seasonal terror into one of humanity's greatest public health victories. The triumph over polio felt like the closing of a dark chapter, a sign that modern science could conquer any microscopic foe. Yet even as the world celebrated that victory, a new and stealthy influenza virus was already slipping across borders, a stark reminder that nature's laboratory never stops. This was the Asian flu of 1957, caused by the H2N2 virus, and it proved that pandemics were not relics of a less sanitary past, but a recurring feature of our interconnected present. It first emerged quietly in the rural province of Guizhou, China, in early 1957. Unlike the terror of 1918, this virus was a master of subtlety. For many, especially healthy adults, it presented as a nasty but manageable flu with fever, cough, and body aches. This very mildness became its greatest asset for spread, as infected people often remained mobile, going to work or traveling while contagious. By the time health authorities recognized the pattern, it was too late. The virus hitched a ride on the new jet-age travel networks, reaching Hong Kong by April and then exploding globally. Within months, it had circled the planet, carried by ships, planes, and railways into every inhabited continent. The global death toll was staggering, estimated between 1 and 4 million lives lost. In the United States alone, over 100,000 people died, with a particularly tragic impact on the very young, the elderly, and pregnant women. Schools and factories saw massive absenteeism, and hospitals were stretched thin, yet the collective memory of this event has largely faded. Why is such a massive pandemic so forgotten? Two key reasons overshadow it. First, its shadow was cast by the colossal, terrifying figure of the 1918 flu. With a mortality rate far lower than its predecessor, the Asian flu simply did not imprint the same level of generational trauma. It was a severe crisis, but not an apocalyptic one. Second, and perhaps more importantly, science fought back with unprecedented speed. Researchers identified the virus quickly, and by the fall of 1957, a vaccine was being produced and administered. While there were not enough doses for everyone initially, and the rollout had hiccups, the very existence of a countermeasure changed the psychological narrative. This was not an unstoppable force of nature, but a managed threat. The world saw a pandemic being actively contained by human ingenuity, which softened its lasting scar on public memory. But the true legacy of the Asian flu is not in its forgotten graves, but in the systems it forced into being. It served as a brutal wake-up call. The World Health Organization, founded just a decade earlier, realized that tracking such viruses required a global early warning system. In response, they established a more formalized worldwide influenza surveillance network, designed to detect new strains at their source and share information rapidly between nations. The pandemic also cemented the understanding that influenza viruses could shift dramatically, not just drift, meaning entirely new pandemics could emerge at any time from animal reservoirs. The Asian flu taught the 20th century a humbling lesson that despite antibiotics, vaccines, and gleaming modern hospitals, humanity remained locked in an endless evolutionary arms race with the flu. Just as that lesson was being absorbed, another virus was waiting in the wings, one that would not be nearly as forgettable and would test every surveillance system the world had just built. The quiet lesson of the Asian flu was still echoing in virology labs when a new threat emerged, one that would become the final global pandemic of the 20th century. In July 1968, reports began to surface of a sudden, severe influenza outbreak in the bustling, dense metropolis of Hong Kong. Within weeks, 500,000 people, 15% of the colony's population, fell ill. This was the Hong Kong flu, caused by a novel virus designated H3N2, and it was about to ride the modern world's fastest pathways to every corner of the globe. Its journey was a map of contemporary conflict and connection. From Hong Kong, the virus traveled with troops and military transports directly into the heart of the Vietnam War. American service personnel, packed into bases and transport ships, carried it home on leave rotations, seeding outbreaks across the United States. It spread simultaneously along international air routes to Europe, Australia, and beyond, achieving full global circulation in a matter of months, a testament to the shrinking world of the jet age. The death toll was immense, estimated between 1 and 4 million people worldwide. In the United States, it claimed about 100,000 lives, a number that included a tragic and unusual demographic. While influenza typically preys most heavily on the very old and the very young, the H3N2 strain showed a particular, if modest, increased risk for younger adults. This was likely because older populations had encountered a similar virus decades earlier, granting them a shadow of immunity while the young had no such defense. Yet, despite this sobering impact, the Hong Kong flu has largely faded from our collective memory. Its arrival was overshadowed by the tumultuous backdrop of its time. The years 1968 and 1969 were a period of profound social and political upheaval, marked by anti-war protests, civil rights struggles, and cultural revolutions that dominated headlines and consciousness. A pandemic, even a deadly one, struggled to capture the public's sustained attention amidst such seismic events. Furthermore, while severe, its mortality rate was lower than many experts had feared based on previous pandemics. It was a serious crisis, but not the catastrophic event some had braced for, allowing it to recede in memory as a bad flu season rather than a historic plague. But to dismiss it as forgotten would be a profound mistake. The Hong Kong flu's true legacy is not in the history books we neglect, but in the very air we breathe each winter. The H3N2 virus never went away. After its initial pandemic wave, it settled into a pattern, becoming one of the main strains of seasonal influenza that circulates every year. This means that the descendant of that 1968 virus is still with us, mutating slightly each season, responsible for a significant portion of the annual flu cases and deaths around the world. It is a pandemic that transitioned into an endemic, a permanent resident in the ecosystem of human disease. Scientifically, it offered another crucial piece of the puzzle, demonstrating the concept of antigenic shift in real time, where two different animal influenza viruses swap genes to create a completely new strain against which humans have little immunity. The Hong Kong flu, therefore, is not a closed chapter. It is a living, evolving legacy, a reminder that the pandemics of the past do not always vanish. They sometimes simply learn to live with us, their final lessons written in the quiet, annual rhythm of coughs and fevers. The Hong Kong flu settled into a familiar, seasonal rhythm, a pandemic that became a regular visitor. But then, in 1977, a medical ghost walked out of the past. Doctors in the Soviet Union and China began reporting an unusual influenza outbreak, but with a bizarre and deeply puzzling signature. It was almost exclusively striking people under the age of 25. Those older seemed mysteriously immune. When scientists isolated the virus, they were stunned. This new pandemic strain, dubbed the Russian flu, was an H1N1 virus nearly identical to one that had circulated widely in the early 1950s. It was as if a virus from 2 decades prior had been frozen in time and suddenly released back into the world. The disease itself was mercifully mild, causing typical flu symptoms but with very low mortality, which is a key reason this pandemic is often forgotten. Yet its origin story is anything but mild, and it remains one of the most controversial chapters in the history of pandemics. How could a virus from the past suddenly reappear unchanged after being absent for a generation? The most widely accepted, though never proven, theory points to a profound human error. In the 1970s, global health authorities, fearing the return of a deadly H1N1 strain, were actively researching it. Many scientists suspect the Russian flu virus escaped from a laboratory. The scenario suggests it may have been accidentally released during vaccine challenge trials, where live virus is used to test vaccine efficacy, or from a poorly secured research sample. The virus, once free, found a perfect target, an entire generation born after the early 1950s that had no natural immunity to it. The older population, having been exposed to its twin decades before, was protected, which explained the strange age-specific pattern of the illness. This theory of a lab leak, debated for decades, transforms the Russian flu from a simple act of nature into a potential case of an accidental, man-made pandemic. It forced the global scientific community to confront uncomfortable ethical and biosafety questions that had never been so urgent. If this was indeed a lab escape, it highlighted the catastrophic risks of manipulating dangerous pathogens without absolute containment. The outbreak prompted a major reevaluation of biosafety protocols worldwide, leading to stricter guidelines for handling and storing influenza strains and other viruses. It served as a warning decades before more recent controversies that our attempts to understand and defend against pandemics could, through a single lapse, become the very source of one. The Russian flu is a quiet, unsettling footnote with a loud, enduring message, a reminder that some of the greatest future threats may not emerge from the wild, but from our own well-intentioned efforts to control them. A laboratory accident may have released a virus from the past, but another pathogen had already begun a silent, decades-long migration from the forests of Central Africa. This is the story of the HIV/AIDS pandemic, a plague that smoldered unseen for most of the 20th century before exploding into global consciousness, and its forgotten early years hold some of the most critical lessons we have yet to learn. Its origins are now traced back to the early 1900s, when a simian immunodeficiency virus likely crossed from chimpanzees into humans in the region around the Congo River basin, possibly through the hunting and butchering of bushmeat. For decades, this novel virus moved quietly along the veins of human travel, the colonial railways and river networks from rural villages into growing cities. It found opportunity in the mid-century movements of soldiers, migrant workers, and the use of unsterilized medical equipment. It was a slow fuse burning through populations, misdiagnosed as other wasting diseases, its true nature completely unknown to the world it was infiltrating. That silence broke abruptly in the summer of 1981. the United States Centers for Disease Control published a report about a cluster of 5 young, previously healthy gay men in Los Angeles who had all developed a rare pneumonia. Within months, similar reports surfaced from New York and San Francisco, describing not just pneumonia but a devastating cancer called Kaposi sarcoma. The medical community was baffled. A disease was dismantling the human immune system, but no one knew what it was or how it spread. The terror was compounded by a rising tide of stigma. Initially called GRID, or gay-related immune deficiency, it was swiftly and wrongly labeled a disease of a specific lifestyle, allowing much of the public and political establishment to dismiss it as a distant problem. This perception tragically delayed a coordinated response and fueled discrimination that isolated the sick at the very moment they needed compassion and care. The mortality in those early years was absolute and horrifyingly swift. Without treatment, a diagnosis was essentially a death sentence. The progression was cruel, a cascade of opportunistic infections that the body could no longer fight. Thrush, a parasitic pneumonia, relentless wasting, and disfiguring cancers. Hospitals' wards filled with young men in their prime being consumed by illnesses the medical textbooks considered ancient history. The fear was palpable, not just of the disease, but of the unknown mode of transmission, which fueled panic and further ostracization. It was a pandemic defined as much by social pathology as by biological reality, a virus that exposed deep fractures of prejudice and inequality. This early chapter of AIDS, often overshadowed by the later scientific breakthroughs and global death toll, teaches a harsh, enduring lesson about global health equity. The virus circulated invisibly for generations in Africa, ignored by the wider world because it affected marginalized populations far from the centers of power. Even when it reached American shores, it was initially ignored because it seemed to target a marginalized community. The pandemic only became a global priority when it became clear it could and would cross every social boundary. AIDS demonstrated that a disease allowed to burn unchecked in one part of the world among one group of people will eventually find a pathway to all people. It underscored that stigma and silence are potent allies for any pathogen, and that the true measure of a society's health is not just in its laboratories, but in its compassion and its willingness to see a shared threat in the suffering of the few. This final forgotten pandemic closes our list not with a mystery of antiquity, but with a living mirror, reflecting the enduring truth that the deadliest outbreaks are often those we choose not to see until the shadow falls upon us all. AIDS forced the world to confront its own indifference, a lesson written in the silence of decades lost. As our journey through these 25 forgotten pandemics comes to a close, a final, crucial question remains. Why were they forgotten in the first place, and what patterns do they reveal when we finally connect the dots? The answer often lies not in the severity of the disease, but in the noise of history. Many of these plagues occurred in the long shadows cast by more famous catastrophes. The plague of Pharaoh is overshadowed by the epic fall of the Sasanian Empire itself. The Russian flu of 1977 was a mild ghost compared to the terrifying specter of the 1918 pandemic that came before it. They become historical footnotes, quiet tragedies sandwiched between louder events. Others were eclipsed by the dramas of human conflict. The English sweating sickness is remembered when it is remembered as a curious sidebar to the Wars of the Roses. The typhus epidemic that killed millions in Russia is a blurry backdrop to the colossal upheaval of revolution and civil war. When cannons roar and empires fall, the silent, feverish deaths in overcrowded barracks rarely make the headline of the history book. Perhaps most tragically, some were forgotten because of who they afflicted. The coccolistly epidemics that emptied Mesoamerica were, for centuries, minimized in narratives that preferred to focus on Spanish conquistadors and their battles, not the biological annihilation of indigenous peoples. A disease that targets the marginalized is often a story the powerful are content to leave untold. Yet when we line these forgotten chapters up, clear, chilling patterns emerge, a playbook for disaster that has repeated for millennia. First, the pathway is almost always human movement. Trade caravans on the Silk Road, troops returning from war, pilgrims heading to sacred sites, steamships carrying cotton, jets ferrying passengers. Each new connection we build becomes a highway for microbes. The Hittite plague arrived with prisoners of war. Cholera rode the steamships of the British Empire. Our greatest achievements in connectivity have always been our greatest vulnerability. Second, fear seeks a target. When a society is baffled and terrified, it looks for someone to blame. Christians were scapegoated during the plague of Cyprian. Chinese immigrants were quarantined in San Francisco. The early victims of AIDS faced devastating stigma. The pattern of turning on the other in a time of pestilence is one of humanity's oldest and cruelest reflexes. Third, medicine is always playing catch-up. From Thucydides struggling to describe the Athens plague to doctors blaming miasma for cholera, every pandemic begins in a fog of confusion. The true mechanism, whether the rat flea for plague or the contaminated water for cholera, is only discovered in the aftermath through the painstaking work of scientists staring into the wreckage. Effective responses, from quarantine walls to vaccines, are born from trial and horrific error. And finally, the impact is never just a number. It is a seismic shift in the bedrock of civilization. These pandemics toppled kings and cleared the way for new dynasties, as in Persia. They accelerated the rise of new religions like Christianity in Rome and Buddhism in Japan. They forced the creation of international law and global health networks. They determined the winners of wars and the fates of revolutions. A virus in a Caribbean mosquito didn't just kill French soldiers, it helped birth a nation. A sleeping sickness didn't just paralyze individuals, it exposed the limits of medical science and the profound mystery of the brain. So these stories are not mere curiosities. They are the hidden wiring of history. The world you live in, its borders, its faiths, its power structures, and its public health systems were shaped in no small part by outbreaks most people have never heard of. They remind us that progress is fragile, that connection has a cost, and that the most decisive battles are often fought not on visible fields, but inside the human body. The past whispers a clear warning through these forgotten fevers. The next pandemic will not be the first, and the patterns are already written, waiting for us to read them. The patterns of the past are not locked in history books, they are blueprints for our present. Look at the word quarantine itself, a direct inheritance from the desperate measures of the 14th century. When the Black Death ravaged Mediterranean ports, Venetian authorities mandated that incoming ships wait at anchor for 40 days before landing, a period they called quarantino, from the Italian word for 40. It was a number chosen not by science but by biblical precedent, a guess in the dark that somehow worked. That exact concept, born of medieval fear, is the cornerstone of every modern isolation protocol. The stone plague wall built around Marseille in 1720, the militarized cordons in Moscow, the strict boarding of houses, these are not antiquated curiosities. They are the ancestral versions of our travel bans, lockdowns, and stay-at-home orders. The tools change, but the instinctive human response to separate the sick from the well remains a constant, proving we have been wrestling with the same fundamental dilemma for 700 years. So too with the battle against misinformation. In 17th century England, during the sweating sickness, pamphlets circulated blaming the disease on the damp air, bad beer, or planetary alignments. During the Russian plague riot, the removal of a sacred icon was not seen as public health, but as an attack on faith itself, a dangerous false narrative that sparked murderous violence. Today, the miasma theory has been replaced by digital conspiracy, but the dynamic is identical: a terrified public lacking clear answers, grasps for explanations that make sense of the senseless, and those narratives can unravel social order just as quickly as any virus. The challenge has never been merely about containing a pathogen. It is about managing the epidemic of fear that travels even faster. Perhaps the most damning and consistent lesson is written in the death tolls of the marginalized. The plague in San Francisco's Chinatown, the coccolustly epidemics among indigenous populations, the initial dismissal of AIDS, these are not coincidences. They are the brutal outcomes of social inequality. Disease exploits pre-existing fractures, finding its easiest pathways through crowded tenements, underfunded communities, and populations without political power or social trust. When the Athenian plague hit, the wealthy Pericles had a country estate to retreat to, the poor did not. The Russian typhus epidemic fed on the filth of refugee camps and prisons. The pattern is relentless. A pandemic acts as a truth serum, revealing which lives a society values and which it has left vulnerable. Our modern maps of COVID-19 hotspots did not draw new lines of injustice. They simply traced over the old ones that have existed for millennia. This brings us to the single most crucial insight these forgotten plagues offer. Pandemics are not black swan events, not freak anomalies that interrupt the normal flow of history. They are recurring features, inevitable eruptions in the ongoing story of human civilization. We live on a planet teeming with microbes, and our species is driven to connect, to trade, to explore, and to conquer. Those two facts are on a collision course always. The Hittite plague, the Justinianic plague, the Third Plague pandemic, they are not separate stories. They are chapters in the same long war with brief ceasefires in between. Our technological world of jet travel and global supply chains has not ended this war, it has simply increased the speed and scale of the battles. Therefore, studying these ancient outbreaks is not an academic exercise, it is a vital drill for our collective survival. It builds our societal immune system. When we understand that travel restrictions have always been a messy, painful tool, we can approach them with more clarity and less surprise. When we see how quickly stigma and scapegoating arise, we can consciously choose a different path. When we recognize that the poorest will always be hit hardest, we can design responses that protect them first, because protecting the most vulnerable is, in the end, the only way to protect everyone. Our preparedness is not just about stockpiling masks or perfecting vaccines, though those are critical. It is about cultivating memory, about remembering that the people of Athens, of Constantinople, of Tenochtitlan, also thought their world was modern, secure, and exceptional right up until the moment it wasn't. Their stories are our inheritance, and their forgotten fevers are the most urgent warning we possess, a whisper from the past telling us to remember, because the next chapter is already being written. That journey across 3,000 years of forgotten fever and fear brings us here to a final, quiet truth. From the desperate prayers of a Hittite king to the silent wards of sleeping sickness victims, from the emptied cities of Mesoamerica to the global shock of a new immune deficiency, these 25 scourges are not isolated tragedies. They are the hidden rhythm of history itself, a relentless cycle of outbreak, devastation, painful adaptation, and most dangerously, collective forgetfulness. We conquer one plague, build walls against it, and then turn our gaze away, believing the battle is won, only for the next microbial storm to find a new crack in our defenses. This is the pattern our ancestors lived, and it is the pattern we have just inherited. But memory is the one vaccine we can choose to administer to ourselves. Remembering these stories is not an exercise in dwelling on doom or living in a state of perpetual fear. It is the opposite. It is the foundation of true resilience. By understanding how societies fractured under the weight of typhus, how faiths rose from the ashes of plague, and how international cooperation was forged in the fires of pandemic, we arm ourselves with the most powerful tool of all, context. We stop seeing each new outbreak as an unprecedented horror and start recognizing it as the latest turn in an ancient, ongoing conversation between humanity and the microscopic world. So we leave you with this question, a spark to carry this history forward. Which of these forgotten pandemics shocked or surprised you the most? Was it the sheer political chaos of the English sweat, the laboratory mystery of the Russian flu, or the silent enabling of the coccolistly? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's continue this conversation. If you want to explore more hidden chapters that shaped our world, be sure to subscribe. Because in our interconnected age, understanding the plagues of the past isn't just about history. It's about building a wiser, more compassionate, and far more prepared future. The next chapter is always being written, but we don't have to face it with a blank page.